OnePlus just announced its latest flagship for 2022 with the new OnePlus 10T. And so in this video, it's time for another camera comparison, as the new OnePlus 10T actually has what looks like four, but it's really three massive lenses on the back here, leading the way with a 50 megapixel Sony sensor. And so why not put it up to the test against the iPhone 13 Pro Max? As usual, please let us know which photos you end up preferring in the comments down below. Also, each photo is raw and unedited, just straight out of the camera. Most photos were taken in standard mode, unless otherwise noted. As I mentioned earlier, there are three pretty massive looking lenses here on the back of this phone. We have that 50 megapixel wide angle main sensor alongside an 8 megapixel ultra wide and a 2 megapixel macro camera. Not sure if the macro lens is honestly useful over something like a telephoto lens, which is what the iPhone 13 Pro Max has, alongside an ultra and wide angle lens, but those are all coming in at 12 megapixels. Now at first glance, these cameras are pretty close to being identical when it comes to image quality. This photo of this ship does a really good job reinforcing that notion, as there's really nothing that I can kind of tell off the top of just looking at it and seeing something dramatically different. That doesn't really give me that vibe. But after reviewing more photos, I did notice a few things that really do stand out between each camera that might be a complete preference thing for most people and could be the leading factor between picking, I don't know, one phone over the other. Cameras are so close these days that it might not really matter to the average consumer, but I noticed that the iPhone does a much better job at balancing the shadows and the highlights, better than what I was seeing with the OnePlus 10T. The building in this photo is much darker than that on the OnePlus 10T. Again, it's a preference thing because in some instances I kind of like the building kind of standing out over what the iPhone is doing here, where it's kind of muting those colors a little bit. But it does seem as if the OnePlus 10T is just a bit more washed out than the iPhone 13 Pro Max. This also leads to a lack of sharpness in most instances. Now, if you're wondering what I mean, just take a look at the textures in these photos, like the gravel, the pavement, the buildings, etc. You can see here that it's not as sharp on the 10T than what you get with the iPhone. Is it a huge deal? I don't know, that's up to you, but it is worth pointing out as these are some of the major differences that I am noticing between these camera systems. In most cases, the color profile tends to lean a bit cooler on the iPhone compared to OnePlus. You can always edit your photos, but if you don't want to do that, this is what you're going to get natural out of the camera. You'll see this when you're observing the sky, the water, or the grass in some of these photos. I think it's close enough to where I really don't have a personal preference. When you switch cameras to the ultra wide, the same thing kind of carries on throughout. There's going to be that lack of sharpness on some instances, like I just mentioned with the 10T, and you definitely have more in the shadows and that cooler profile with the iPhone. Now, the OnePlus 10T does have something called Super HDR that uses OnePlus's HDR 5.0 and Turbo RAW algorithms that, combined with that 50 megapixel sensor, offers what OnePlus calls more contrast between the foreground and the background lighting. And you can definitely see that's what's happening with the main sensor, sometimes almost to a fault. It might be doing just a little bit too much in that department at times, but this is likely the reason behind some of those washed out results. Now, the OnePlus 10T does not have a telephoto lens, so when we start to zoom in past a certain point, we do start to rely on digital zoom for nearly everything. And it looks pretty good overall, but you're never gonna beat that optical sensor from what you get on the iPhone, where it's a dedicated lens for that. And then you also start to see the color profile completely switch. Everything is really dramatic. So the digital processing is changing the way the photos look. And so it is worth mentioning that you are gonna get a different image kind of overall when you start to zoom in more. But I do think the quality holds up, especially when zooming 2, 5, 10, and 15x. As you can see here, the more we zoom in, I think it holds up pretty well. But again, the color profile and temperature and everything just kind of changes, which is weird, but I'm guessing that's mostly from the digital processing. Also worth mentioning here that since there is a 50 megapixel camera, you can actually turn on that high quality 50 megapixel photo, which you're gonna have massive photo sizes, so something to keep in mind. You probably can't take all of your photos like that, or you're gonna eat through storage like crazy. But you don't get that with the iPhone's 12 megapixel sensor. Now, megapixels aren't everything, but I am curious to hear your thoughts, as this is a raw 50 megapixel photo compared to what you're seeing on the iPhone's just point and shoot, main sensor, 12 megapixel photo. So again, anything you see here that you want me to know, and I want to see your comments, let me know in those comments down below. Now, when switching to portrait mode, both cameras perform very, very well in this department. You do get two different angles for portrait mode photos. You have that kind of a cropped, tighter shot, and then you have a little bit of a wider angle shot. I think both do a great job. There's a bit different artistic styles going on here. As you see, the iPhone not only blurred the background, but also a bit of the foreground, which does actually make for a really cool photo. The OnePlus did not do that, but it did keep everything looking sharp and crisp, and then it blurred out that background quite a bit. When we go to the wider angle portrait shot that I have here, I noticed that the OnePlus had far more bokeh over the iPhone. The iPhone remained subtle with its background blur. OnePlus dialed it up quite a bit, but it looks really well done. It's not overly processed and looking a little bit unrealistic, but it's really, really sharp, and I'm happy with results from both cameras. For low light, the OnePlus 10T offers up Nightscape 2.0 and combines its custom algorithm with the hardware capabilities of that 50 megapixel Sony sensor, which according to OnePlus should do a pretty good job at capturing photos in lower light settings, and basically when you're out and about at night. And so as you can see here, I do like the low light images that I was able to get from both cameras. I'd probably lean a bit more towards the iPhone. You have a little bit more options to mess around with, especially with the shutter, with night mode, but overall I think both cameras are pretty much right there with each other. There are a few other modes that I wanted to briefly touch on. OnePlus does have a movie mode, which is kind of similar to the Pro mode that you get for photos, where you can adjust a lot of controls that you would on something like a DSLR camera, but you can do it for video. And you can also switch to shooting log mode for greater dynamic range, which is something you cannot do on an iPhone. Speaking of videos, I wanted to keep things at 4K quality with a standard frame rate, either 24 or 30 frames per second, but you can shoot at up to 60 frames per second with both phones. Both cameras are also, again, pretty close in quality. You're still getting the same image that you would get with the photos, so a lot of the things that I mentioned with the photos is going to carry over to videos, and then really we can kind of tell with stabilization that they're both really good. I mean, it's a flagship in 2022. I definitely have no problems with the 4K video capability. Again, I think I might lean towards the iPhone, but it's really hard for me to say. I hate to just kind of sit on a fence for these sections, but they're so close that I really do think it could be a toss-up. There's also a macro mode that utilizes the 2 megapixel dedicated camera, and honestly, I don't think that's necessary. I mean, the photos that we get for both are fine. I just, don't think we need a dedicated camera for that. I would have loved to see more companies kind of adopt the iPhone route and go with a telephoto lens and then use one of the other cameras as the ability to use it for macro mode as we have here. And so you let me know in the comments down below what you think about that, but personally macro mode, I don't really find it as useful as just having a telephoto lens. Overall, I still think the OnePlus 10T has a great set of cameras. I do think it lacks a bit of sharpness compared to the iPhone, as I pointed out earlier, and there are certainly some differences with HDR photos and how the highlights and shadows are processed, but again, it's 2022. Each device is gonna come with a great set of cameras. If you're platform agnostic and you just want the best camera, I would still probably lean towards the iPhone, but again, I think you're gonna be happy with whatever you pick. Honestly, it's a great set of cameras. OnePlus has really come a long way because in the earlier days, I didn't really like the images that came out of those phones, but they have improved so much over the last few years as a company, and especially with their image quality. And of course, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. This has been Dan with Mac Rumors. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you around in the next video.